Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. And it is Tuesday, December 30th, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, Tuesday, December 30th. Just 2 more days to the end of somebody has referred to this as the Annus Horribilis, which means the horrible year of 2025. And reminds me of that old Beatles song. I got to admit it's getting better. It can't get no worse, but we'll have to see about that. Um, but the topic that I want to talk about is real estate, and I think it's really fascinating that the negotiations that have been going on in between the United States and Russia have been conducted by two real estate speculators. Um, of course, Jared Kushner, who's the he's not the commander in chief. He's the real estate broker in chief, Donald Trump, and his good buddy Steve Witkoff. Now let's put this into context. Who is um, the first real estate speculator in chief in the United States? You can take three guesses. One, two, three. Okay. The first real estate speculator in the United States was George Washington. So George Washington he got his start in real estate as a real estate surveyor. So he knew these people, and he'd go out and survey land and decide, what land is good and what land isn't, and then they'd come up with ideas of how to determine how to get filthy rich, stealing land from the Native Americans. Kind of interesting. But anyway, so he was the first speculator in chief. He ended up being the richest man in America. That's interesting, based on real estate. And of course, he was also a slaveholder. That helped. Slaves are worth a lot of money. So, so anyway, so you have George Washington being the first real estate speculator in chief, and we have a bookend now with Donald Trump being the real estate speculator in chief, and it's not like, if you're the president of the United States, there's the executive branch, the judiciary, and the Congress, and part of the executive branch is the State Department, but you don't. It turns out that in all these negotiations that have been going on with Russia, the main people that he's been sending are his two real estate buddies. His good friend and his son-in-law. It's really it's. I can't believe it. And I was just listening to I think one of the commentators was noting that poor Marco Rubio is feeling sad and left out because he's not only the national security advisor, but also the Secretary of State. And yet he's being left out of the negotiation. This is a real estate deal, guys. What's your problem? So I thought, well, what is going on here? And so what I came up with this theory. And I want to mention also that one of the most important aspects of the American economy has been real estate scams. And so below in the description, I have listed a bunch of the most famous American real estate scams, which is how people got rich. And according to my research, like the guy who founded Stanford University and these other people, they were basically real estate people, and that's how they made their money. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. So here we are, and but I'm trying to think of I'm a kind of a theoretical person, so I'm thinking, what is it about this? Why is this? And it seems to me that there are three main ideas that are shaping big thinking of how the American system thinks. And They're based on three books that I'm thinking of. One of them is Halford McKinder, and I forget the name of his book. I got it somewhere. It doesn't matter. But he was talking about his idea was he who controls Eurasia controls the world, is able to command the world. And his thought, because he was a British geopolitical thinker, was that the British had a navy, and their idea was if you could surround Eurasia, which is Europe and what is now the Russian Federation and China and India and all those countries that make up this huge, largest continent in the world, if you can control its periphery with naval power, then you can eventually control it. And so it's no surprise that the evil, Russians and Chinese are threatening the West because they put their countries so close to our military bases. How dare they threaten us that way? But that's what they do, and we have to keep building up our military budgets and threatening them and putting sanctions on them and all this kind of stuff because, what right do they have to decide what they want to do? We're the ones who control the world, not them. So that's Halford McKinder. And the other book that I was thinking of was that other evil person, Vladimir Lenin. And he wrote a book called Imperialism, the Final Stage of Capitalism. And what he said was that as the economies develop in capitalism, as it develops, it reaches a kind of a saturation point within its own borders. And so it needs to find new markets. It needs to find, it's parasitic. So who are we going to suck the wealth out of? That's the issue. And we gotta export our money to someplace, and then we'll get a return on investment, pulling wealth out of these countries. I saw there was I think during a 200-year period, the United Kingdom pulled $45 trillion. That's more than the U.S. national debt. $1 trillion out of India. And then you wonder why India got to be so impoverished. It had a huge economy. India and China were the two major countries in the world in terms of their population and their economies, and both of them were decimated by the West. But I have a slightly different theory, and that is that I think that imperialism, or that rather that capitalism didn't come out of imperialism. He says imperialism is the final stage of capitalism. I say more like capitalism came out of imperialism. And the reason why I say that is because when the Spanish went to the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese, but especially the Spanish, they landed up in Mexico and the Incas and so on, and they pulled massive amounts of gold out of what we call Latin America, those empires. They were major civilizations, and they've been completely crushed. And you talk about genocide; they were basically destroyed. But they pulled massive amounts of gold out of those countries, and so the gold has to go somewhere. And so, I think a lot of the development of the Western banking system was based on plunder of resources of other countries. And then as the Western economies developed, they said, okay, now we got all this money. Now what do we got to do with it? So it was a kind of like a feedback loop where capitalism actually came out of plunder and imperialism, rather than thinking that imperialism was a consequence. So there's kind of a back and forth between the two. So that's my idea. And unfortunately, Lenin is not here for me to debate that point. And I'm sure there are other experts in Leninism and Marxism who would tell me I'm an idiot. But so I'm just Guy, talking here. Okay, now in the third book that I read that is very important, and I read this years ago, but the basic point of this is called The Decline of the West. This was written by Oswald Spengler, a German historian who wrote this book between 1918 and 1922. And he was talking about the fact that Western civilization started going downhill. People thought that Western civilization was rising, but in fact, it essentially essentially it created the roots of its own demise, you could say, through the First World War and then the Second World War, and the whole neo-colonial and imperialist project eventually reached a point where it was unworkable, and the people who were oppressed by the European powers, because this was a European project. You know, you have a lot of little countries like Holland controlled what was called the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia. It's a large country with a lot of land and a lot of resources. And Holland, it's a very, very small country, grew rich because of getting control of countries like Indonesia. And of course, the Spanish Empire, became a small country. It became very rich. And Europe and Germany had colonies in Africa, and Portugal is a small country. They had colonies in Brazil and in Africa, and Africa was basically divided up in the French. These are small countries that were able to become quite rich because they were essentially parasitizing. They were basically plundering the wealth out of the rest of the world. But the problem was that the people who live in the rest of the world seemed to have this strange idea that they didn't really like being treated like shit. So they eventually were able to push them out. But it's been difficult because the Western banking system still has had a lot of control over it, a lot of control over the flows of money and capital in the world, and of course of resources. So here we are now in the situation where there's this very valuable piece of real estate that the West wants to get its hands on, namely Russia, because it has a lot of resources. And there was and the idea was that if they could take this landmass of the Soviet Union and break it up, then they would slowly but surely be able to disintegrate it and capture all its resources. And the first step in that process was to split the Soviet Union up and make Ukraine, which had been a part of Russian civilization for 1,000 years, and split it off, and then using the most, what can I say, the most backward part of what was a country that had essentially been cobbled together from parts of Poland, parts of Hungary, parts of Romania, parts of Slovakia, large parts of Russia. So they cobbled this country together, and then they split it off. And then when the Soviet Union ended, it was split off. But you see, during World War II, there was a faction within Ukraine that was they were quite very violent, and these were the so-called Banderites, the followers of Stefan Bandera and Lebed and Shukevich and others, who were they were considered Russian Ukrainian nationalists, but had a very kind of racist and violent ideology. So they responded to the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941 by allying with the Nazis and committing lots of atrocities. They weren't the major part of Ukraine. Most of the Ukrainian people in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at that time sided with the Soviet Union, and they were able to defeat them. But they basically went underground, and then as time went on, it was like they were, as I say, they were operating underground. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, now the CIA and other George Soros and many of these NGOs came in, and through couple of decades of indoctrination and brainwashing convinced the Ukrainian people that Russia was not really their friend, it's really their enemy, and that they should fight it and kill everything Russian. And that is the basis of the conflict in Ukraine. But the problem is that it's not working. Russia has fought back from near oblivion. They really were trying to break it up. I mean, they had sent Islamic terrorists into Chechnya and other parts of southern Russia, and fortunately for Russia, not fortunately for Western imperialists. Vladimir, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, he was able to kind of claw back control of the economic system out of the hands of Western oligarchs and bankers, and also from these kinds of terrorists who are causing a lot of problems. Okay, so but then you still got Ukraine. It's sitting out here, and they're trying to figure out how can we use Ukraine as a foil to undermine the Russian Federation. So they staged this coup in 2014, and they were attacking the people in eastern Ukraine who were Russian speakers, who were being persecuted and bombed. Civilians were being bombed. Well, somehow I don't understand why people in the West, after 8 years from 2014 to 2022, these very, very intelligent, educated people didn't know what was going on in Ukraine. And they think, oh, Russia invaded unprovoked. These people, they have an overweening concept of their own intellectual superiority when they haven't done the damn homework, and they don't know the history, and so they come up with these stupid ideas about how poor little Ukraine was invaded by nasty big bear Russia. They don't understand the context of it. So anyway, Russia, and at that time, I said to my friends, you don't understand. You think Russia invaded unprovoked and they're going to lose. And it's taken a while because Russia did not do a shock and awe, destroy Ukraine, which is what the United States did in Libya and in Iraq and Syria. These are countries that were decimated because of U.S. Military interventions, and U.S. and NATO military interventions. And Russia said, we're not going to do that because Ukrainians, whatever their problem is, they're still considered part of our Russian family. We're not going to slaughter them the way all the civilians, destroy their cities, so on and so forth. They did not do that. But as this war has developed, they've gradually reached the conclusion that they're going to have to, basically they realize they're not fighting Ukraine, they're fighting NATO. When it reaches the point where British and French and American missiles are attacking Russia, it is not what it looked like as a civil war between Ukraine within Ukraine. The Russian realized this is not a civil war. This is a war of the West against Russia. It's a war to the death, and that because this goes back to Halford Mackinder. They desperately have to get control of Eurasia. Their system is collapsing due to its own decrepitude as systems collapses. This is Oswald Spengler. That's what he's talking about. And so between the Spengler's notion of an historical inevitability and Lenin's idea of capitalism's historical failure over time, the whole Eurasian project is failing. So that's the point that I'm trying to make here. And but the question is, who do you send? What is this all about? It's this landmass, and who do you send to negotiate over a large landmass? You send your best real estate guys. So that's the reason why Donald Trump the real estate speculator in chief sent his two lieutenants, so to speak, to negotiate with the Russians. And the Russians are saying, okay, well, we'll have, we got a couple of our pet capitalist, people here, and they'll talk to you. But Sergei Lavrov or Ryabkov and some of these other people who are part of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, oh, you want to talk about real estate deals? Oh, okay, we can talk with them. Okay, this is none of our business. When you decide to get serious about real treaties that work, send us a team of diplomats. We don't want to talk to real estate speculators. Okay, so that is what this whole thing is about, and it just it's actually kind of humorous and pathetic at the same time that the United States is sending real estate speculators instead of diplomats to negotiate an end to a war that should never. Donald Trump was right that this war should never have happened. The United States, they do not have a concept of cooperative relationships in business. It's always exploitative. It's what it's always been for 500 years, and it's all about the land. Just in closing, they said, and the Africans, they said, when the missionaries came to us, they said, God is wonderful, and here's a Bible, close your eyes and pray. And when we opened our eyes, we had their Bible and they had our land. So it's all about land. And that's why Donald Trump, as a real estate speculator, is the president of the United States. And he may well preside as being the last president of the United States, just as George Washington was the president of first president of the United States. So that's what I have to say here. And I hope you'll support my channel. And this is probably a rather quirky analysis, but I'm sure, I doubt if anybody else on the internet has talked about it in these terms. So thank you very much for listening. Please support my channel by sharing this idea with people. And my apologies to all the tender egos whose feelings have been hurt. But what can I do? I'm just who I am. And but thanks again for listening. And if you can make a contribution or sign up to be a member of Substack, or buy one of my information billboard T-shirts like this one. I just got a new one here. You can see it says here, open your own treasure house and use those treasures. So that's an old Zen saying, and you can order these on Amazon or someplace. I'll figure out someplace else where you can buy them. And that's it for today. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon.